Okay, so this episode of the podcast came from a follower question on Instagram. And that question was, which is more important for building muscle? Is it time under tension or is it lifting heavy? So what I'm going to do over the course of this particular episode of the show is I'm going to break this question down for you and give you the answer to tell you whether it's time under tension or whether it's lifting heavy that's going to get you the biggest, the best results known to man. So without further ado, let us get cracking on this one. So I want to firstly talk about the actual question itself. Now, some people might not know what time under tension means, and let's dive into that then. So time under tension is basically generally thought of as going slow on your reps. So if you think about you doing a bicep curl, you're trying to create the maximum amount of tension. So as you let that bar go down, you're kind of creating more time under tension because you're doing a very, very slow negative movement that's creating a lot of tension in the bicep. You're spending more time in that process. And then when you come to contract the bicep and lift the bar up, again, you might do that quite slowly as well to again force a lot of tension into that muscle. So therefore, the theory being is that the more time you spend under tension, the greater the muscle growth will be. So that's what that means. Now the question is this overplayed? In the realms of trying to build muscle, trying to, whether it's biceps, triceps, chest, glutes, quads, whatever it is you're trying to build, is tension the key driver or is it kind of overplayed? So we'll get onto that in a second. The other kind of, I guess, is a bit more bro science, a bit more sort of the theory you'd get from some hench dude in the gym who's jacked up, would be the kind of like almost, I'm going to say it, Neanderthal way of thinking that it's lift big to get big, eat big to get big. It's kind of that principle of just lift heavy is kind of the answer to, it's kind of a coverall for every answer there ever was to building muscle. Just lift heavy, just eat a shit ton of food. That's kind of a bit of bro science coming in there. Now we're going to break this down for you and we're going to sort of figure out, well, is there any hint of truth in the bro science? Is it a case of, yeah, there's like a nugget of truth in that that's been mainly overplayed and overblown? Or is it just complete horseshit? Or is it a case that the tension thing is the way to go? Now, let's start off then by looking at what is going to be the key thing you need to think about in terms of building muscle. And it's something called progressive overload. And again, a phrase that some of you might not have heard of before, but this is where we're actually trying to overload the muscles in certain different ways in order for us to force it to adapt and grow, get bigger, get stronger, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is mainly achieved through something called mechanical tension. And mechanical tension can be achieved through more reps, more sets, better execution of an exercise. So effectively, you're progressing the amount of actual tension, the amount the muscle is pulling on that bone, because that's how shit works. Muscles are attached to bone. How much actual mechanical force you're pushing through that one particular muscle. So you can increase the amount that's happening by just doing more reps. You can do that by adding more weight to the bar. You can do more sets. You're actually putting more volume through that muscle. You're putting that muscle under more tension over time. Now, there are a couple of other things that are going to help with building muscle, but for now, we're going to park those to one side and we're just focusing on this whole mechanical tension thing. So you might be thinking now, okay, Simon, you've mentioned mechanical tension. So is there a hint of the answer in that specific phrase? So is it a case that if we want more mechanical tension, then time under tension has to be more important? So is that more important than load? Is it more important than lifting heavy weights? Well, to me, the answer is this. They're not mutually exclusive. So without tension, you're not training the target muscle that you're trying to work. Anyone can lift a ton of heavy weight badly. You'll see it in gyms the world over, whether they're bench pressing and just bouncing it off their chest, whether it's a bicep curl that's real swinging and getting a huge amount of shoulder work going in, whether it's a squat that's either bouncing out the bottom of the squat or whether it's a case of you even doing like a quarter squat, a half squat, just trying to cheat yourself out of a full repetition because you want to lift a shit ton of weight to impress your friends. You want to do some sort of video on Instagram, which actually makes you look like a complete utter fucking moron when someone who actually knows what they're looking at looks at it and go, what the fuck are you doing, son? Anyway, so there's that. Without any tension, then you're not really working the muscle. If you're not working the muscle, it's not going to grow. But it's no good benching 5 kilos and curling the pink dumbbells every time you go into the gym, just because you want to make sure that that execution is actually, an 11 out of 10 on the scale. It's a case of at some point you're going to need to keep challenging the muscle, and you're going to have to do that with weight. You're going to have to do that with extra load at some point. But then there's the other question of, okay, I get the fact that you need tension, and I get the fact that at some point you need load, but what about time under tension? Does it matter how long, in that given rep, does it matter how long you spend in that rep? Is like a super slow repetition in both the negative and the contraction actually more beneficial? Well, I would argue, and I think that you'd find it difficult to argue that for most exercises, a slower negative will be better for building muscle. That whole process of, say, letting the weight go down, that is going to make that exercise harder, because that's essentially what you're trying to do. Is you are trying to make that muscle work as much as possible. You are trying to make that exercise as difficult as possible for that target muscle, so that it has to work harder, it has to adapt. This is not like powerlifting, where you're actually trying to make it as easy as possible to lift that weight. You are actually trying to do the reverse. You're trying to make this really difficult for your muscle, and you're trying to make it work. Therefore, a slower negative really helps that. Does it have to be like 10 seconds long? No, but something very slow and controlled is likely in most exercises to be beneficial for building muscle. Now, on the flip side of that, the concentric, i.e. the bit where you're working, doesn't necessarily have to be super, super slow. It can be if you want to train like that, if you like that. Sometimes it's good for beginners because it can be very difficult for you to actually feel the muscle working. So sometimes opting for a slower tempo can help you achieve that. Now, that doesn't mean to say you can't move the weight a little bit more quickly. However, you've got to use the muscle that you're trying to target, and you've got to use it with intent. So if you want to move the weight quickly, by all means go do it, but you have to do it on the foundation of you can make that muscle work when you do that. And that's the key thing. And this is where training age, training skill starts to come into play. Now, a beginner is rarely going to have the ability to contract the muscles, to have the mind-muscle connection, to be able to move a weight quickly with the maximum amount of tension and intent and really work that muscle. So if you're a beginner, intermediate, probably a slower repetition, a slower tempo pace is really going to work better for you. Therefore, you could argue that time under tension for a beginner may be a more beneficial thing, but not necessarily just for the purposes of building muscle. It's also for the purposes of getting technique right and being able to feel the muscle in the first place. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, as long as I go slow, I'm going to build muscle. There's a bit more to it to that. You still have to think about what's going on. However, if you are slightly more advanced, you know what you're doing, you can feel the muscles, then absolutely you can push it with a lot of force. You can push that weight quicker if you want to generate more power. Again, as long as you're under control and you're providing tension through that muscle, you can absolutely 100% do that. And kind of what I would bring things back to as a little bit of a summary is that if you want to build as much muscle as possible and you're thinking whether should I spend more time under tension or should I just go and lift heavy, then I bring it back to the Iron Paradise principle of lift. So this is where we have a 4-step process to making sure you optimize everything you're doing in the gym. So the first option or the first thing is lock it. That's the L. So we lock things in place. That's your position to make sure that you're lifting from a stable base and you're actually therefore not letting other muscles and other sort of joints, things take over. We're actually locking a position in place so that when we lift, we're lifting with the muscles that we're intending to move that weight with. The next one is I, which stands for intent. So this is where we're talking about, okay, we want the pec to work when we're doing a bench press. So, okay, now before I lift that weight, I'm going to use my muscle connection to say, right, okay, can I contract that pec before that weight moves? And can I keep that contraction going throughout the entirety of that exercise, that repetition? That's lifting with intent. The third one then is force. And this is where you've got your position set up, you can feel it in the muscle. Now you're going to generate as much force as possible. You're going to put as much effort through that particular exercise as you can. Then finally, you're going to look at tension. So tension is where can you maintain tension throughout the entirety of the rep and a solid tempo. So you can see that based on those principles, you can't really separate one to say, okay, well, it's just all about tension or it's just all about weight. All these components are important. So execution and tension is needed. So you're going to need to be able to execute the exercise effectively. You're going to need to be able to create tension in the muscle, and you're also going to need to be able to lift some load at some point. When you've got that form solid and you feel like you can increase the weight and still keep that form, you can still keep that tension, you can still execute that exercise effectively, then yes, keep moving up the weight to force that muscle to adapt, to force that muscle to grow. So they are your key component parts of that sort of muscle building equation. And that's the answer to whether time under tension or lifting heavy is most important. The answer really is they're not mutually exclusive. You kind of got to do both. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the show. If you did, come visit me on Instagram. Tell me what you thought. Ask me a bunch of questions if you have them at iron_paradise_fitness. And if you like what you've seen and what you've heard on this particular episode of the show, then why not head over to ironparadisefitness.com, where you can see a bunch of different articles. You can look at my online coaching program. You can download some free guides. You can download a free Kickstarter pack, which has got a free 4-week training program in it, a guide on nutrition, and a bunch of other stuff. Head over to ironparadisefitness.com and you can check out all of that. But for now, all I'll say is keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next episode of the show.